The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Debating, Is Jesus God? Hey everybody, this question came in from another patron, specifically since we're focused on debates and debating God, debating issues related to religion and everything else. Kevin sent a message that says, hey Matt, if someone were to challenge you to a debate where the topic is Jesus God? Would you accept it and why? Would appreciate to know your brief thoughts. The topic can mean, one, is Jesus actually God or a God? And two, does the New Testament believe that Jesus is God? I'm an atheist. I was asked by my friends regarding this topic. The topic kind of felt weird to me since this kind of question is theological in nature and is often a debate between two people with different religions. This question is not really something atheists often discuss. If you were to engage in such a topic, what are the points that you would ask or raise against this notion? Because I'm thinking that if we have to agree first with my opponent about a definition of God and if there's evidence that Jesus manifested such characteristics. Yeah, so thanks, Kevin. Thanks for teeing up an interesting discussion. Is Jesus God is a debate, you're right, that probably isn't all that addressed all that much. There's a lot of arguing that goes back and forth on point 2 of yours. Does the New Testament believe that Jesus is God? I've argued with Aaron Ra about this, and a little bit. I'm a little bit in disagreement with Bart Ehrman. I'm in agreement with what Bart Ehrman actually says, which is that Jesus didn't expressly claim to be God. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So the answer to the question, would you accept this debate? Yes, assuming everything else is agreeable. You know, we're venue and rules and the moderator and the opponent. And what I replied with was, yes, I'd accept, assuming all other aspects of the debate were acceptable. 2 words, Jesus isn't. And I wondered if that would be enough information for Kevin. Kevin basically came back and said, thanks. But I thought it was interesting enough that it was worth kind of addressing here. Jesus isn't. Not Jesus isn't God, but Jesus isn't. So obviously, whenever you're doing a debate topic, there are things that you're going to need to address. This is not just a semantic trick on my part. It's a genuine thought about one of the many different ways that someone could approach this debate. It's a real issue. Is versus was. Well, we definitely need some definition of God. And I don't want to dig in too much on this. Let's just say God is a being that exists eternally. There's more, but that's enough for this, that God exists eternally, which means that if God was, God also is, and God will be. Boom, we've got a definition of eternal. It doesn't matter about his features or qualities or anything else at the moment, but a being that exists eternally. Question is, first, did Jesus exist in the past? I don't know. I don't have a problem with the notion that there was somebody named Jesus that they were talking about. Mythicists think that Jesus didn't exist. I understand, and I agree with a lot of the points they say. They're adopting a burden of proof that I don't think can be met. But I'm sure we'll have David Fitzgerald on the show again bunches of more times in the future, and I'm sure that'll be the topic of many conversations. The thing is that David and I aren't that far apart, and me and other mythicists aren't that far apart. This is partially a thing about strategy, which I just did a video about. Don't adopt a burden of proof that you may not be able to meet. And so I don't need to adopt that burden of proof, because the fact that Christians can't conclusively demonstrate that Jesus used to exist at all with anything more than an attempt at a reasonable inference, that's a problem. But if Jesus did exist and was God, past tense, then he must still exist, because God is defined as a being that exists eternally for the purposes of this discussion. So my 2 words, Jesus isn't, is in some ways the challenge to that. Because if you can't demonstrate that he exists currently, then you have no hope of demonstrating that he is God. If you can't demonstrate that he is, you can't tell me that he is God. His current existence is a fact upon which his divinity is contingent. Because if Jesus exists and is divine, he could absolutely show up and demonstrate his existence and presumably his divinity. The question that I've been asked for years of what would change your mind, and my standard answer of, I don't know what would change my mind on this particular subject, but if God exists, God knows absolutely what would change my mind. And if God exists and has the characteristics people say that he does, God should be capable of changing my mind. And if God desires me to know that he exists, God should be willing to do what it would take to change my mind. And the fact that this hasn't happened means that God either doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists yet. Whether or not God wants me to know he exists at some point in the future, I can't say. But so far, that's where we're at. Now, if we're doing this with God being divine as a being that exists eternally, so if you can't show that he exists, you can't show that he is God. But if Jesus existed as divine, he could show up and demonstrate this existence of divinity. And if you know Jesus to be divine, if you personally not just are convinced and believe it, but if you're claiming that you know Jesus to be divine and that Jesus still exists, you should be able to provide that evidence for this. Because if it's private revelation, you can't provide that, and I don't think that that's sufficient for demonstrating knowledge. I think knowledge is, while some people might define it as justified true belief, I think knowledge is an expression of confidence in a belief, and that warranted knowledge is confidence that is warranted by the strongest epistemological standards, which would be independent verification, peer review, things like that, not just some esoteric kind of private revelation. And if your evidence for Jesus existing isn't compelling, then it is weaker evidence by definition than what Jesus could present. And if Jesus wanted better evidence to be presented, he could do that. So if your claim is Jesus is God, then he still exists. And presumably with some other features of God, he should be able to present evidence for this. At least he could show up and interact. And he's not doing that, which means anything that you do to try to argue that Jesus exists is necessarily weaker than what Jesus could present. It may still be sufficient, but you'd have to present it. And so if this is an important issue and you're not able to actually present the strongest evidence possible, but Jesus is, are you even sure that Jesus wants you to try to answer this question? I don't know how you could be sure of that. You could show that it's doctrinal. You could show that it's in the Great Commission, but that's about what the Bible says, not what Jesus says or said. You haven't demonstrated that Jesus existed or said anything, or that the words that are attributed to him in the Bible are even accurate. And I'm not just talking about like translation accurate. I'm not just talking about the fact that it was, hearsay, passed down, written, changed. I don't care about any of that. Did Jesus actually at any point, if he existed, convey the message, I am? And how do we know that he said this? And then how do you know that it's true? This is where we get to the second part of the potential question, which is, does the New Testament believe that Jesus is God? I'll set aside the little thing of the New Testament doesn't believe anything, but the authors of the New Testament, charitably, it's reasonable to say that the authors of the New Testament seem to strongly suggest that Jesus is God, implying it in incredible terms, the Gospel of John being the one that is most clear about this, equating Jesus with the Word and saying, the Word, well, what he says at the beginning of his Gospel is not Jesus was God, but altogether taken as an introduction, it is definitely making that claim without using those particular words. Now, that, though, isn't Jesus saying so. Instead, Jesus is attributed with things like, before Abraham was, I am, the I am statements I talked about before. And so charitably, yes, you could say the New Testament strongly suggests that Jesus was God, or that they believed that Jesus was God. But the problem is, how do we know that those words of Jesus is, if he even existed? We have no way to test the accuracy of those words. And I mean that in a twofold sense. The accuracy that Jesus said those words and the accuracy that those words are in fact true. Because whether the New Testament portrays Jesus as God or whether the authors believed he was God is irrelevant to whether or not he is God. So is Jesus actually God? First, I'd ask, is Jesus? That was the two-word thing, as in, does he currently exist? Where's the evidence for that? Clearly, nothing in the Bible can be used to demonstrate that Jesus or a God exists currently, because the books in the Bible are a collection of claims and views of humans, and they need supporting evidence. In addition to the previous notes about existing eternally and the need to demonstrate that, in order to reasonably conclude that Jesus is God, we'd need, one, a demonstration that Jesus currently exists. Not, I believe Jesus exists. Not, I'm incredibly convinced that Jesus exists. Not that I think Jesus has done a powerful work in my life. Not that I know Jesus delivered me from sin or from alcohol. No, you don't know that. Or at least if you know that, you need to show us how you know that. So that's number one, a demonstration that he currently exists. Number two, a demonstration that the most reasonable explanation for his current existence is that he's God. Because even if he existed and showed up and walked in here right now and said, hi, I'm Jesus. Yes, the one they spoke about in the Bible. And said, they may have got some things wrong, some things right, but I'm him and I'm here to talk to you. We would need evidence that this person saying this is in fact Jesus. I don't know how you go about demonstrating that. But that the most reasonable explanation is that he's God. And as Arthur C. Clarke pointed out, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so I don't know how to determine if something is in fact a God or just some technology we don't understand. I don't know how to rule out those other possible explanations, but that's okay. Because I would argue that while we only listed a being that exists eternally as a God, the normative views of God, with regard to God's knowledge and power, suggest that God should probably know how to overcome Arthur C. Clarke's objection. He should know how to overcome that hurdle by providing the sort of evidence that would allow us to distinguish between something we don't understand and godhood versus magic. If it is in fact not possible to overcome Clarke's hurdle and a God exists, then it seems that we are forever blocked from having any sort of reasonable confirmation of a God. But if Jesus is God and still exists, if Jesus would just show up one of these days, answer some questions, do some miracles, and overcome Arthur C. Clarke's hurdle, that would at least be an incredibly impressive start. Thousands of years on, that doesn't happen. Ever. Why not? Is it because he doesn't exist or because he's hiding? And how can you tell the difference? I don't know how you can say Jesus is God until you can show that Jesus is. See you next time. Bye-bye.